Imagine starting your new job full of excitement and anticipation, only to encounter an invisible barrier, a silent resistance that undermines every effort you make. Madison Carter, a talented young professional, faces this scenario on her first day at a multinational company. What should have been a brilliant opportunity quickly turns into a battle against prejudice and injustice, coming from where she least expected. In this video, you'll follow Madison's story and her journey to prove her worth in a toxic and challenging environment. She will face public humiliations, shocking twists, and, in the end, uncover secrets that will change her view of her own path. Will Madison overcome these obstacles and come out stronger? Or will the barriers imposed by those around her stifle her potential? Stay until the end to discover the surprising conclusion to this emotional and twist-filled story. If you enjoy stories of resilience and transformation, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Let's explore this journey together. Madison Carter arrives early at the multinational office on a cloudy morning. The air is heavy with the smell of fresh coffee mixed with the light scent of wood from the old furniture. She's wearing a neatly pressed suit, maintaining a confident posture, though inside, the anxiety of her first day is evident. As she steps into the reception area, her eyes take in the details of the space: marble floors, glass walls reflecting the hurried movement of employees, and a large metal sculpture in the center of the hall. Everything appears orderly and professional, but an invisible tension hangs in the air. She clutches her freshly printed ID badge with sweaty hands, knowing that behind her calm exterior lies the pressure of being the only black woman in a predominantly white environment. Her mind races, recalling the advice from her family about needing to be twice as good to be considered half as much. As she walks toward the elevator, she sighs, trying to push aside her worries and focus on what truly matters: her work. Upon reaching her floor, Madison is greeted with a cold smile by Mrs. Anderson, her new direct manager. The meeting room is already full, with colleagues exchanging murmurs while preparing their notes and laptops. Mrs. Anderson, a middle-aged woman with blonde hair and an air of superiority, seems disinterested as she quickly and distantly shakes Madison's hand. "Welcome, Madison. Let's see how you fit in," Mrs. Anderson says, with a subtly condescending tone. Madison feels the weight of each word. She smiles, though the coldness strikes her like a gust of icy wind. As she sits down, her eyes scan the room for any sign of support, but she notices that some colleagues avoid eye contact, as if they are already aware of the dynamic between her and Mrs. Anderson. The tension begins to build, silent but palpable. During the meeting, Madison tries to stay engaged, listening closely to the discussions about the company's processes. She has some ideas on how to optimize operations, based on her past experiences and recent studies. But as she prepares to offer suggestions, Mrs. Anderson interrupts her, without even looking in her direction. "Let's focus on what's already working, Madison. Save those ideas for later," she says, with a slight ironic smile, while the other employees remain silent. Madison pulls back, surprised, but mentally notes the reaction. She knew there would be challenges, but she didn't expect this type of treatment on her very first day. The room seems to cool even more, and the subtle tension she had felt upon arrival begins to take a more concrete form. Back at her desk, Madison tries to focus on her work. The rhythmic sound of keyboards and the hum of computers around her feel distant as her mind wrestles with what had just happened in the meeting. She had heard stories about microaggressions in the workplace, but experiencing it firsthand on her first day was demoralizing. "Are they going to treat me like this every day?" she wonders. But Madison is resilient. She takes a deep breath, remembering what her mother always told her: "You're not here by accident. Prove your worth." The tension is just beginning, and she knows she needs to stay calm and not let Mrs. Anderson undermine her confidence. The battle, she thinks, will be long, but she's prepared. As the afternoon progresses, the office atmosphere remains cold. Rain starts to fall outside, with droplets tapping against the large windows of Madison's office, creating a constant sound that mirrors the mood of the day. She watches her colleagues, trying to understand their dynamics, but she feels that, in some way, she's already been excluded from some invisible circle. Every glance, every gesture seems to reinforce the distance between her and the others. The stage is set, and Madison knows that something bigger is coming, something that will change the dynamic forever. The morning begins cold, with a light breeze slipping into the meeting room as someone opens the door. The humming sound of the air conditioner creates a constant rhythm, while the light aroma of freshly brewed coffee fills the air. The papers on the table crinkle slightly as the projectors heat up. Madison sits next to Jack, feeling the slight pressure of her pen in her hand as she mentally reviews the main points of her presentation. She had prepared for days for this moment. When her turn comes, she stands, adjusting her blazer to ease the light nerves. Good morning, everyone. I wanted to share some ideas that I believe can help optimize our processes. She begins, her voice calm but firm. She projects a slide with charts and indicators. As she starts explaining her suggestions, Madison feels Mrs. Anderson's cold gaze piercing her. This sounds interesting, Madison. Mrs. Anderson interrupts suddenly, a stiff smile on her face. But perhaps you're overestimating the team's ability to implement something like this, especially in your first month. Don't you think? The air seems to grow denser. The hum of the air conditioner now sounds louder, as if amplifying the rising tension. Madison, with her heart racing, tries to respond. I understand it may seem ambitious, but I believe with the right team, we can achieve significant results, she insists, trying to stay calm. Mrs. Anderson lets out a dry laugh, crossing her arms. Maybe we should focus on what's already working instead of reinventing the wheel. But I appreciate the effort, her voice subtly cutting as she shifts her gaze to the other colleagues. The room falls silent. The sound of keyboards and mouse clicks from other employees is the only thing breaking the awkwardness in the air. Jack, sitting beside her, shifts uncomfortably in his chair, avoiding direct eye contact with Madison. Madison feels a slight warmth rise to her face, but she hides her discomfort with a polite smile. She sits down, her mind racing, still processing what had just happened. Back at her desk, the environment feels suffocating. The strong smell of coffee, once inviting, now seems nauseating. The buzz of distant conversations and the constant click of keyboards create a cacophony that echoes in Madison's mind. She tries to focus on her documents, but Mrs. Anderson's words continue to reverberate in her head, overestimating the team's ability. She wonders why she was interrupted in that way. Does she really believe I'm incapable, or is there something more behind it? She thinks, her fingers nervously tapping on the keyboard. The rhythmic sound of the keys is the only thing keeping her thoughts anchored in reality. Her eyes wander to the window. Outside, clouds are beginning to form, foreshadowing a storm. The pressure in the air seems to match the one she feels in her chest. As she tries to reorganize her thoughts, Jack approaches her, looking hesitant. He stops next to Madison's desk, and the subtle scent of his cologne mixes with the stuffy air in the room. Madison, do you have a minute? He asks, his voice low, as if worried someone might overhear. She looks at him, trying to read his expression. He seems uncomfortable, as if about to step into dangerous territory. Sure, Jack. What's up? She responds, her voice calm, though she can already guess what he wants to say. Jack glances around before speaking, as if fearing Mrs. Anderson might appear at any moment. I saw what happened in the meeting. It was intense, he says, his words coming out in a whisper. Madison crosses her arms, trying to maintain her composure, but her frustration begins to spill over. You think? I couldn't even finish a sentence without being interrupted. She responds, a hint of bitterness slipping into her voice. Jack hesitates, scratching the back of his head. Mrs. Anderson is tough on everyone, but I've noticed she's especially hard on you. I don't know if it's personal or something else, right? Madison interrupts, raising an eyebrow. She feels the weight of those words. Something else, she knows exactly what that means. Jack sighs, seemingly unable to give a direct answer. He pats her shoulder lightly before stepping away. "I just wanted you to know you're not alone," he says, before turning and leaving Madison alone with her thoughts. Madison retreats to the bathroom, the only place where it feels like she can have a moment of peace. The cold, fluorescent light reflects her image in the mirror, and she stares at her reflection, trying to find strength in her father's words. She closes her eyes for a moment, attempting to block out the cacophony of thoughts. "You have to be stronger than this," she thinks. But Mrs. Anderson's words continue to reverberate in her mind. The bitter taste of humiliation is still present, like she had just swallowed something unpleasant. The sound of someone entering the bathroom pulls her back to reality. She takes a deep breath, fixes her hair, and decides she can't let this affect her. Not now. There's something bigger at stake, and she can't afford to lose focus. The late afternoon arrives with a heaviness in the air. The distant sound of thunder mixes with the hurried pace of footsteps in the hallway. A new meeting is about to start, and Madison knows it will be decisive. A new project has been put on the table, something that could elevate her career. She sits in the meeting room, observing the environment as she feels the light touch of the air conditioner on her skin, a contrast to the electricity in the atmosphere around her. The smell of the leather chairs and the metal of the pens on the table create a familiar, yet uncomfortable mix. Mrs. Anderson, with her impeccable posture and cold gaze, stands at the front of the room. She looks at everyone, as if she has already decided who will lead the new project. Madison, prepared, feels the heat of anticipation rise up her spine. But then, with a simple gesture, Mrs. Anderson breaks the tension. "Jack, you'll be in charge of the project. Madison, you can assist if needed." Madison feels as if the air has been sucked out of the room. The sound of a raindrop hitting the window seems deafening at that moment. She can't believe what she just heard. The opportunity she had been waiting for was, once again, snatched from her hands. She looks directly at Mrs. Anderson, who avoids any eye contact, as if the disdain was implied in her choice. Jack, clearly uncomfortable, gives a hesitant nod, and the rest of the room remains silent. The injustice is palpable, and Madison knows this is the breaking point. Now, something needs to change. Monday arrives with a stifling heat, as if the very air in the office were heavy with tension. Madison, sitting at her desk, feels sweat gathering in her palms, even under the cool blast of the air conditioner. The continuous sound of phones ringing in the distance and the incessant clicking of keyboards around her make the environment feel suffocating. She reviews the documents for the project she should have led, but now she's been relegated to a support role. Each page she turns makes her stomach churn. Suddenly, the phone on her desk rings, the loud, shrill sound breaking the monotonous rhythm of the office. It's a call from Mrs. Anderson, asking her to come to her office immediately. "Madison, come to my office. We have some issues to address." Mrs. Anderson's voice is cold and professional, but there's an underlying tone of impatience that Madison can't ignore. As she stands up, Madison feels the gaze of a few colleagues following her, as if they know something is about to happen. The faint creaking of her sandals echoes through the hallway as she walks toward the glass door of the manager's office. Upon entering Mrs. Anderson's office, Madison is greeted by a faint floral scent mixed with the strong perfume of the manager. The office is impeccably organized, with neatly stacked papers, and the soft whir of the ceiling fan adds a low hum to the room. Mrs. Anderson sits in her leather chair, her hands folded on the desk as she watches Madison enter. "Sit down," she says, pointing to the chair in front of her, without making direct eye contact with Madison. Madison sits, feeling the cold leather against her legs, and waits for Mrs. Anderson to speak. The manager flips through some papers, deliberately taking her time to create more tension. "I've noticed you're still working on Jack's project," Mrs. Anderson finally says, her tone slightly accusatory. I'm not sure if it's a matter of misunderstanding your responsibilities or if you're trying to stand out in some way, but this isn't working." Madison takes a deep breath, feeling the weight of the words hit her like a punch to the stomach. "With all due respect, Mrs. Anderson, I'm just doing what was asked. I'm assisting with the project, as you requested," Madison responds, her voice firm but with a slight tremor of indignation. Mrs. Anderson raises an eyebrow and crosses her arms. "Supporting doesn't mean making decisions on your own. Next time, consult me before suggesting any changes to the processes. It's important that you understand your place." The phrase, "understand your place," rings in Madison's mind, like a knife being slowly twisted. She feels the heat rise through her body, but maintains her composure. However, the air seems to grow heavier by the second in that room, and she realizes this situation is far from being a misunderstanding. It's personal. After the conversation with Mrs. Anderson, Madison meets Jack in the company cafeteria, a large space with bright fluorescent lights that make the environment feel cold and sterile. The smell of industrialized food lingers in the air, while the noise of conversations and trays being dragged adds a layer of chaos to the moment. They sit at an isolated table, away from the commotion. "This is getting worse," Jack says, absent-mindedly poking at his salad. "Mrs. Anderson is really focused on doing things her way, and I feel like you're being treated unfairly." Madison sighs, pushing the food around her plate without any appetite. The metal of the spoon scraping the plate echoes in her ears. "It's not just a matter of preference, Jack. She sees me as a threat. I don't know if it's because I'm new or because of who I am, but it's clear this isn't just about work." Madison responds, her voice low but heavy with emotion. Jack hesitates for a moment, looking around to make sure no one is listening. "I agree, Madison. It seems personal, and it's uncomfortable seeing how she treats you," he admits, running his hand through his hair in a sign of nervousness. Madison looks at him, pondering his words. She knows Jack is in a difficult position too, being unfairly favored. "And what are you going to do about it?" she asks, challenging but not aggressive. Jack avoids her gaze, his expression uncertain. The silence between them is only interrupted by the distant buzzing of a coffee machine in the cafeteria. At the end of the day, Madison walks slowly to her car in the parking lot. The night is cooler, but the cold wind doesn't relieve the tension she carries on her shoulders. The sky is dark, with heavy clouds foreshadowing a storm. The smell of wet earth already begins to rise from the ground, even before the rain falls. She gets into the car, the interior silence contrasting with the soft hum of the engine as she starts it. As she drives, her thoughts circle around what happened during the day. The anger and frustration she felt now blend with a growing sense of helplessness. "I have to do something," she thinks. But what? She remembers her father's words, always encouraging her to fight against injustices, but also to be strategic. The problem is that at that moment, Madison doesn't know what her next step will be. She doesn't want to seem weak, but confronting Mrs. Anderson directly feels dangerous. The sound of rain starting to hit the windshield brings Madison back to the present. The raindrops beat rhythmically, almost as if they match the pounding of her racing heart. She takes a deep breath, trying to calm down, but she knows the conflict is far from over. The next day, Madison arrives at the office, feeling a slight knot in her stomach. The air inside the room feels denser than usual, as if everyone knows something is about to happen. The sound of the air conditioner seems louder, mixing with the sound of phones, ringing, and muffled voices in the background. Madison tries to focus on her work, but she can feel Mrs. Anderson's gaze on her, even without seeing it. By mid-morning, Mrs. Anderson calls for a new team meeting. The tension in the room is palpable, as if everyone is waiting for something important. "We need to discuss the next steps for the project," Mrs. Anderson announces, her voice firm and authoritative, as she organizes some papers. "Jack, I'd like to hear your ideas about the changes you've proposed." Madison feels a shiver run down her spine. The ideas Jack is about to present are the ones she suggested, the same ones that were ignored when she brought them up weeks ago. The sound of papers being shuffled by Mrs. Anderson seems to echo throughout the room, and Madison realizes the situation is about to explode. The meeting room is packed, with the air conditioner humming loudly, as if trying to compensate for the tension dominating the environment. The faint smell of paper and printer ink seems to linger in the air. Jack, visibly uncomfortable, begins his presentation. He focuses on the charts, avoiding direct eye contact with Madison, who sits beside him, her hands clasped in her lap, trying to hide her growing frustration. So, with these changes, we can optimize the workflow by about 15%, reducing processing time, Jack says, his voice slightly trembling as he moves to the next slide. The ideas presented were clearly those that Madison had suggested earlier. Mrs. Anderson, arms crossed, gives a slight nod of approval. Well done, Jack. This is exactly the kind of initiative we've been looking for, she comments, not even glancing at Madison. Madison, who had remained silent throughout the meeting, can no longer hold back her indignation. The strong smell of coffee in the room, the clicking of laptops, and the murmuring of colleagues make the moment feel surreal. She takes a deep breath and, with a firm but controlled voice, interrupts the presentation. "Excuse me, Jack, may I add something?" she asks, looking directly at him. Jack hesitates, quickly glancing at Mrs. Anderson, who maintains an impassive expression. "Sure, Madison," he responds, his voice almost trembling. Madison stands up, feeling the heat rise through her body. Each movement seems to echo in the silent room. She walks toward the projection screen, pointing at the charts Jack had presented. "These are the same suggestions I made weeks ago," she says calmly, but with restrained tension in her words. "And back then, they were dismissed as not feasible." The air in the room seems to freeze. The murmuring stops. The faint clinking of coffee cups in the background is the only thing breaking the silence. Mrs. Anderson, visibly irritated, uncrosses her arms and leans forward. "Madison, I don't think it's productive to revisit past issues. We've already discussed this," she says in her usual icy tone, but her eyes narrow slightly, revealing the tension that's beginning to build. Madison remains calm, but her gaze does not waver. The silence is now overwhelming. She knew she was stepping into dangerous territory, but something inside her wouldn't let this go unnoticed. After the meeting, Jack approaches Madison in the hallway, where the distant sound of printers and phones creates a constant background noise. The smell of freshly cleaned disinfectant fills the air, while Jack hesitates, shoving his hands into his pants pockets. "Madison, I'm sorry," he begins, his voice low. I should have mentioned that the ideas were yours." Madison turns to him, her face calm, but her eyes reveal the anger simmering beneath the surface. "It's not just about mentioning it, Jack. You know those ideas were mine, and you know exactly why Mrs. Anderson ignored them when they came from me," she replies, crossing her arms, while the distant sound of footsteps echoes down the empty hallway. Jack lowers his head, clearly ashamed. He looks around, making sure no one is listening. "I'm really sorry. I didn't want to cause any problems. You know how Mrs. Anderson can be," he says, his voice barely a whisper. Madison slowly shakes her head, her frustration growing. "That's exactly the problem, Jack. Everyone is afraid of her, and as long as you all stay silent, she's going to keep acting this way," Madison replies, her tone serious. Jack has no more words. He slowly steps away, leaving Madison alone in the hallway. The sound of Jack's footsteps fades as he walks away, and Madison stands there, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on her shoulders. Madison returns to her desk, but her mind is far from work. The constant sound of keyboards around her feels distant, almost like background noise disconnected from reality. She stares at her computer screen, where numbers and charts no longer mean anything at that moment. Her chest feels tight. The once familiar smell of coffee now seems nauseating. How long will this go on, she wonders. Everything she's done so far has been an effort to prove her competence, but all she gets in return are veiled rejections and barriers. Mrs. Anderson's words echo in her mind, while her colleagues' expressions during the meeting remain etched as a bitter memory. She closes her eyes for a moment, feeling the light, cool breeze from the air conditioner brush her face, trying to calm herself. But she knows that if she doesn't act soon, this could become a permanent pattern. I have to confront this. I can't let them keep treating me like this, she decides, her determination growing. Later that afternoon, while Madison is reviewing some reports, a notification pops up on her screen. She clicks on it, and to her surprise, it's an email from one of the company directors, Mr. Richards. The email is short and direct, requesting an urgent meeting the following day. Madison feels her heart race. What's going on? She thinks, feeling a slight tension in the air. The light tapping of the keyboard under her fingers seems to echo louder than usual as she tries to continue working. She looks around, seeing her colleagues engrossed in their own tasks, unaware of the inner turmoil she's feeling. Mr. Richards' message is unexpected, and a strange feeling begins to grow inside her. Has Mrs. Anderson gone too far this time? She wonders. Anxiety now accompanies her for the rest of the day. The next morning, Madison enters the meeting room where Mr. Richards is waiting for her. The atmosphere is formal, with glass walls letting the sunlight flood the room, creating a stark contrast with the darkness she feels inside. The smell of polished wood and the soft hum of the air conditioner create an air of neutrality. But Madison knows this meeting is anything but ordinary. Mr. Richards, a man with graying hair and a stern posture, gestures for her to sit. The silence in the room is almost oppressive, broken only by the faint clicking of a pen in the director's hand. Madison, I asked you to come because a situation has arisen that I need to discuss with you directly. Mr. Richards begins, his voice deep and serious. We received some complaints about Mrs. Anderson's behavior, and after reviewing the situation, we believe you could provide an important perspective. The air seems to disappear from the room for a moment. Madison feels her heart pounding in her chest, but she keeps her composure. The faint smell of fresh paper and the soft sound of the ceiling fan seem to intensify as the truth slowly comes to light. She takes a deep breath before responding. Yes, Mr. Richards, I have a lot to say about this. The air in the meeting room is heavy with tension, the sound of the ceiling fan blending with the distant clicking of keyboards in the adjacent office. Madison sits in front of Mr. Richards, the executive director, as he watches her closely. His eyes convey seriousness, but also a slight hint of understanding. The soft light filtering through the large windows illuminates Madison's face, and she feels the growing pressure. I'm ready to speak, Madison says, her voice firm but with a sense of urgency. Mr. Richards crosses his arms, leaning slightly forward. Madison, it's important for you to know that we're investigating this thoroughly. Mrs. Anderson is aware that the situation has reached a critical point, and the company does not tolerate discriminatory behavior in any form. We want to hear your side before moving forward, he states, his voice filled with gravity. Madison takes a deep breath, feeling the heat rise through her body, mixed with the cool breeze from the air conditioner. Every word she is about to say could change the course of her career and the dynamics of the workplace. She begins to describe, in detail, each episode of humiliation, every time she was silenced, and each moment when Mrs. Anderson devalued her. Her hands tremble slightly, but her voice remains steady. She undermined me at every opportunity. My suggestions were always rejected, only to be accepted when someone else presented them. The entire time, it felt like I had to prove I even deserved to be here. Madison confesses, feeling the weight of her words. Mr. Richards listens attentively, jotting down notes. After a moment of reflection, he stands up and walks to the door. I think we've heard enough. I'll call Mrs. Anderson in to clarify a few things, he says, leaving the room. The silence that follows is overwhelming. The sound of her own heartbeat seems to echo in Madison's mind. She mentally prepares herself, for what's about to happen. A few minutes later, Mrs. Anderson enters the room, her posture upright and her face impassive. The strong smell of her perfume fills the room, contrasting with the tension that now envelopes the space like an invisible cloud. She sits down across from Madison, not breaking eye contact. "What's going on here?" Mrs. Anderson asks, her voice laden with authority but with an undertone of challenge. Mr. Richards wastes no time and begins. "Madison has brought up serious issues regarding your behavior. We're investigating reports of discriminatory treatment. We need to clarify these situations." Mrs. Anderson's face hardens, and a look of disbelief takes over. She lets out a short, dry laugh. "This is ridiculous. Madison, are you really insinuating that I treated you unfairly?" Her voice sounds cold and controlled, but there's hidden anger behind it. Madison, despite her fear and adrenaline, stays composed. The distant sound of rain beginning to fall outside mirrors the emotional storm she feels inside. "It's not an insinuation, Mrs. Anderson. It's a fact. Every time I made a suggestion, you interrupted me. Every time I tried to contribute, you dismissed my efforts. And when Jack presented my ideas as if they were his own, you praised him." Madison responds with forced calm, but with the conviction of someone who has finally decided to take a stand. Mrs. Anderson crosses her arms, and for a moment, the silence in the room feels eternal. The sound of rain tapping against the window is the only noise filling the space. "I was just doing my job, ensuring that decisions were best for the team. If you felt diminished, perhaps it's because you still don't understand how things work around here," Mrs. Anderson retorts, her tone laced with thinly veiled contempt. Mr. Richards quickly intervenes. "That does not justify disrespectful or discriminatory behavior, Mrs. Anderson. We have multiple reports of your conduct, and it's now clear that there is a pattern here," he says, his voice firm. The atmosphere in the room shifts drastically. Mrs. Anderson's gaze falters for a brief moment, as if the gravity of the situation is finally sinking in. Mr. Richards stands up, his expression severe. "Mrs. Anderson, I'll be direct. The company does not tolerate this kind of behavior. We are dealing with an issue of integrity and respect in the workplace, and your conduct is under formal investigation. As of now, you are suspended from your duties while this investigation continues." Mrs. Anderson rises abruptly, the sound of the chair legs scraping against the floor echoing throughout the room. "This is absurd. I'm being unfairly accused," she exclaims, but the desperate tone in her voice reveals that she knows the situation is out of her control. Madison watches the scene silently, feeling a mix of relief and tension. Emotions are running high, and the atmosphere feels heavier than ever. The sound of rain outside remains constant, creating an almost cinematic backdrop to the climax of the situation. "If there's anything you'd like to say in your defense, Mrs. Anderson, you'll have the opportunity. But for now, I suggest you leave," Mr. Richards concludes, gesturing toward the door. With clenched fists, Mrs. Anderson walks out of the room, her footsteps echoing down the empty corridors. Madison finally feels the air return to her lungs, as if she had been holding her breath the entire time. Mr. Richards turns to Madison, his gaze now softer. "Madison, I know this wasn't an easy situation, but you did the right thing by bringing this up. We'll make sure a fair investigation is conducted, and that the company takes steps to ensure this doesn't happen again." Madison, still processing everything that had just happened, simply nods. "Thank you, Mr. Richards. I just hope this leads to creating a more respectful environment for everyone here," she responds, her voice slightly trembling, but filled with determination. "You can rest assured we will work on that," Mr. Richards concludes, extending his hand to her. The firm handshake seals the moment. The smell of rain seeping through the window cracks blends with the relief that finally begins to wash over Madison. She leaves the room, feeling the weight on her shoulders finally start to lift. As she walks back to her desk, Madison looks around the office. The environment seems the same as always. The sound of keyboards, the murmur of conversations, the smell of coffee in the air. But for her, everything feels different. She had won a battle she knew she needed to fight, and now the path ahead seemed less cloudy. Sitting at her desk, Madison takes a deep breath. The soft sound of rain outside still echoes, but now, instead of bringing tension, it seems to bring a new beginning. She smiles, knowing that at last her voice had been heard. The next morning arrives, with the office feeling quieter than usual. The smell of fresh coffee, mixed with the soft fragrance of flowers decorating the reception area, gives the space a sense of renewal. Madison walks in with a serene but cautious demeanor. She knows Mrs. Anderson's absence, now suspended, has left a leadership gap. The sound of footsteps echoes through the halls, but there's a lightness in the atmosphere that wasn't there before. As she walks toward her desk, Jack approaches, his face filled with uncertainty. The familiar scent of Jack's cologne reminds her of the tense moments they've shared. "Madison, I just wanted to thank you for speaking up. You were brave, and I think we all learned something from this," he begins, looking a little embarrassed but sincere. Madison smiles slightly, nodding. "I didn't do this just for myself, Jack. I did it because it was the right thing to do. We need a workplace where everyone is respected, and I hope this is the start of a change," she replies, her voice soft but firm. Jack nods, seeming relieved. "I agree, and I want you to know that if you need anything from now on, you can count on me," he adds, offering a sincere handshake. Madison accepts, feeling the tension between them finally dissipate. Hours later, in the afternoon, Madison is called in for a meeting with Mr. Richards. The light smell of polished wood and the soft hum of the ceiling fan create an atmosphere of formality in the room. As she enters, she senses something different in the air, a feeling of imminent change. Mr. Richards greets her with a slight smile and invites her to sit down. "Madison, I have some news that may interest you," he begins, crossing his arms thoughtfully. "With Mrs. Anderson's suspension, the leadership of your department is temporarily vacant. After reviewing your work and your conduct during this time, I'd like to offer you a position with greater responsibility." Madison is surprised. The ticking of the clock on the wall seems amplified as she processes the words. She never imagined things would escalate so quickly. I appreciate the trust, Mr. Richards. I wasn't expecting this," Madison responds, still absorbing the offer. Mr. Richards smiles, more openly this time. "You've shown that you can lead, not only technically, but also with integrity. I believe you're the right person to help guide this team through this transitional period. Think of this as an opportunity to show what you can do with more freedom," he says, making it clear that this is a significant chance for Madison. Madison feels a mix of excitement and apprehension, but she knows she's ready to take on the challenge. She nods, determined. "I accept. I'll do my best," she says, with renewed confidence. Madison was focused on her new responsibilities when her phone buzzed on her desk. It was a message from her father, Mr. Carter, the company's executive director, asking her to meet him privately. A sense of unease came over her. It wasn't common for her father to make this kind of formal request. The sound of the phone vibrating, mixed with the hum of the air conditioner, intensified the nervousness growing inside her. Shortly after, she headed to the office he had reserved for them. Upon entering, the soft smell of leather from the sofa and the gentle late afternoon light streaming through the windows contrasted with the tension she felt in her chest. Her father stood by the window, looking out at the city. He slowly turned as he heard the door open. His eyes, usually firm and confident, seemed to carry a weight Madison had never seen before. She sat down, feeling her heart race, but maintaining a composed expression. "Dad, what's going on?" she asked, trying to stay calm. Mr. Carter looked at her for a few seconds before taking a deep breath. He ran a hand through his graying hair and walked over to the chair in front of her, sitting down slowly, as if the words he was about to say weighed more than he'd like. "Madison, I have something important to tell you, something I've been keeping to myself for a while." He began, his voice low but filled with emotion. Madison frowned, her unease growing. She had never seen her father so hesitant. The smell of cold coffee and the silence in the room made the atmosphere even more tense. "What do you mean?" she asked, now more nervous. He looked at her with eyes full of regret, something Madison wasn't used to seeing in her father. I knew about everything that was happening between you and Mrs. Anderson from the start," he admitted, his voice breaking slightly. "I knew how she was treating you. I knew about the struggles, but I chose not to intervene." Madison felt like the ground had fallen from beneath her feet. The revelation hit her like a stone. She blinked a few times, trying to process it. The tension in her shoulders intensified, and the familiar smell of leather in the air now seemed suffocating. "What?" Her voice came out almost as a whisper, filled with disbelief. "You knew? And you did nothing?" Mr. Carter leaned forward, his expression heavy. He placed his hands on the table, his fingers interlocked, as if trying to hold something back. "I wanted you to prove your strength on your own, Madison. I wanted you to show that you could succeed without relying on me. I thought it would make you a stronger, more respected leader. But now I see how much it hurt you," he said, his voice laden with sorrow. Madison abruptly stood up, the sound of the chair scraping the floor echoing through the room, cutting through the heavy silence. She took a few steps toward the window, looking out but not really seeing anything. Her chest rose and fell with her accelerated breathing. "You watched while I was humiliated, while I felt abandoned," she shouted, the words coming out with unexpected force. "You had the power to change everything from the beginning, and you chose to let me fight alone? Why, Dad? Why?" The air around them seemed heavier, as if each word intensified the tension between them. Mr. Carter slowly stood up, his eyes fixed on his daughter. He took a step forward, his voice now softer, almost pleading. "I thought I was doing what was best for you. I thought I was making you stronger, that you needed to face these challenges without my intervention to grow. Madison, I didn't want you to live in my shadow," he explained, his voice faltering at times. Madison turned to face him, her eyes filled with tears. She had never imagined that her father, her greatest example of strength and leadership, would choose silence at such a crucial moment. The feeling of betrayal weighed on her heart in a way she couldn't describe. "In your shadow?" she repeated, her voice full of bitterness. "You left me alone. All those times I was disrespected, humiliated. You knew and did nothing. How could you think that would make me stronger? It almost destroyed me." Her voice trembled at the end, and she had to stop to catch her breath, fighting back tears. Silence fell over them for a moment. The only sound was Madison's heavy breathing and the soft noise of the wind outside, rustling the leaves on the trees. Mr. Carter's face seemed heavier than ever, the lines on his face more pronounced. "I'm so sorry, Madison," he said, his voice now filled with regret. "I made a mistake. I underestimated how much this would hurt you. I didn't realize how deeply it was affecting you until now. I just wanted to show the world how amazing you are without people thinking you're only here because you're my daughter." Madison closed her eyes, trying to calm the storm of emotions inside her. Her father's words made sense on some level, but the pain of having faced everything alone was still there, throbbing. She took a deep breath, opening her eyes and meeting her father's gaze. "I understand what you were trying to do, Dad, but you should have been by my side. Even if you didn't interfere, you could have supported me in other ways. I didn't need to go through this alone." Her voice was calmer now, but still full of emotion. Mr. Carter stepped closer, his eyes filled with pain and regret. "I know, Madison, and I'm so proud of how you handled everything, even without my help. You're stronger than I ever imagined. But I want you to know that even without acting, I was always by your side. I never stopped believing in you," he said, his voice almost a whisper. Madison looked at him, feeling a mix of anger, pain, and love pulsing in her chest. She knew her father loved her and wanted the best for her, but the wound was still open. After a few moments of silence, she nodded, letting out a long sigh. "Maybe I proved my strength, but it wasn't fair." She paused, her voice softer now. I just hope that from now on, we can be more honest with each other. I need to know you're with me, Dad. Even if it's from a distance, I need to know I can count on you. Mr. Carter, visibly emotional, nodded slowly. I promise from now on it will be that way. I'll never let you face anything alone again, Madison. And most of all, I'm sure you're going to do amazing things moving forward. He extended his hand, and Madison took it, feeling the comforting warmth of her father's touch. The silence that followed was no longer filled with tension, but with understanding. Madison knew the road ahead would still bring challenges, but now she felt there was reconciliation between her and her father. The weight of the truth had been exposed, and with that, a new beginning was in sight. Back at the office, Madison reflects on everything that had happened. The sound of keys being pressed around her and the soft hum of the air conditioner now seem distant. She feels that her journey there is just beginning, but now from a place of strength and recognition. Looking out the window, the light rain that had been falling earlier in the week has given way to sunshine, which shines gently, reflecting off the windows of the buildings around her. The city looks clearer, brighter, as a symbol of her new perspective. Madison knows challenges will still come, but now she faces them with the confidence of someone who knows she can overcome any obstacle. As the day comes to an end, Madison gets ready to leave the office. The soft sound of music playing in the background accompanies her as she gathers her things. She closes her laptop and, looking at the black screen, sees her own reflection. The woman she sees now is different from the one who first walked into that company. Stronger, wiser, and above all, more determined to fight for what's right. She leaves the building, feeling the light evening breeze touch her face. The sky is clear with no sign of rain, and the fresh air brings a sense of renewal. Madison smiles, knowing that despite all the battles, the future looks promising. Conclusion. Madison Carter faced prejudice and challenges that few could endure. From daily humiliations to the final twist involving her own father, she showed that resilience and courage are essential to overcoming any obstacle. But the question remains for all of us. How many times do we go through similar situations without even realizing it, or without the strength to fight back? Could someone in your workplace be experiencing something similar? Are we ready to stand up for what's right, even when it becomes uncomfortable? Madison proved her worth, but her story is a reminder that sometimes the hardest battle is the one we fight silently within ourselves. I'd love to hear what you would do in her place. Leave your comment below and tell me, would you face the situation head-on or take a different path? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories like this. See you next time.